Hello, AP Lang. I am going to attempt to help you feel a little bit more confident as you approach those pre-20th century texts that have been a little bit troublesome for you with both multiple choice and rhetorical analysis. Hopefully, my tips here will help you feel good when you tackle the activity that I've posted for you with a pre-20th century text. And as my humorous subtitle states, thou shalt succeed whilst in pursuit of lucidity, right? You're going to find success with finding clarity in these texts, I promise. We're going to keep working at it. So just so we're on the same page, I just want to make sure we all know what I mean when we say pre-20th century text. Yes, we all should know that it's a text written before the 1900s. So you have a lot of texts in the 1700s, the 1800s, even Shakespeare in the 1600s, right? You have a lot of famous nonfiction and fiction, but we're going to look at nonfiction texts from those time periods. So because of that, a lot of the words are unfamiliar to us, modern English speakers. A lot of times you'll have Old English or antiquated diction, words that just have fallen out of our everyday use, or the meanings have changed over time. So that's what makes it a little bit tricky. These texts are often tied to these major historical events. So the more you know about world and US history, the easier it might be to place that text in a context, in the occasion, and really understand what the author might be trying to say, what position he's coming from. You'll have really complex syntax. Sometimes it's inverted with the verb that comes first. Sometimes you just have very long sentences that are attached with semicolons and commas, and you just have to make sure you don't let that get in the way. And obviously the topics are often pretty complex, and that just adds another layer of difficulty to what we're trying to do. But that's what we're talking about here. So your question would be, how am I supposed to understand these texts if they are so tricky? So we're going to go over these 5 strategies that I have found successful, other students have found successful in trying to better understand these texts. So let's look at them one at a time. The first one, you really know well. You've been practicing it definitely since freshman year, maybe even since the 8th grade, but being a methodical, active reader, right? Purposeful, pace yourself, be active, have your brain engaged, have your hand engaged with a pen or a pencil. You have to do this with these texts. You cannot skim. You cannot skim these texts. You cannot try to save time. You have to really read them to understand them. And I know that's hard when it comes to testing situations, but you really have to take the time to understand what you're reading. Otherwise, you risk completely writing a wrong response or answering all the multiple choice questions inaccurately because you've misunderstood the passage. So make sure, as hard as it might be for some of you guys to do, be active readers and take your time. Engage your brain, underline those keywords, those key ideas. Sometimes there'll be lines in the text that are really clear compared to some of the other ones, and really highlight those. Especially you can find things with your 5 W's, right? Who is he talking about? What is he talking about? Where am I? Like any of those key pieces, key ideas, big ideas, just underline them. If your brain thinks it's important, underline it. It helps draw your attention to it, and it helps you stay focused on what you're reading. Also reread as needed. That's really important. You're going to read a section and your brain is going to say, what? And don't just keep reading. Go back and reread what you just read, and maybe try to read a little more actively, trying to really focus on what is he talking about? What is she talking about? What's the author talking about? And get in the habit of jotting down quick margin notes. If you do have a section that seems a little confusing, you can put a little question mark and come back to it if you feel a little rushed for time. But more importantly, if you think the author is speaking positively about something, put a little plus sign. If it's negative, put a little negative sign. Do any quick little summary notes for yourself to clarify. So ask questions if you feel like they're helpful, but get in the habit of jotting those things down. It's only going to make you more engaged with what you're reading, and engagement is the first key to actually understanding what you are reading. It's also going to help stamina so that you don't feel exhausted and tired after trying to work through the first, couple of sentences. So that's the first one. And then something for these types of texts that's really important is take the time to understand the context. On the AP exam, you're going to have descriptions, at the top telling you something about who the author is and, what this piece is and when it was written. You're going to have some idea of the context. So take the time to recognize the historical era. You're going to know the time period. So think to your other learnings. Do you know anything about this era that would help me understand the thoughts and feelings of the people around this time that might help you gain access to what this author might be trying to say. You have to remember that sometimes whatever the text is referring to is outdated. So you have to put aside any preconceived notions or any current beliefs that you have and make sure you're really looking at what the author is trying to say. Something, 200 years ago may be ridiculous now, but we have to make sure we go back and we think of the time period and think that this perspective may have been novel at the time or may have been really accepted at the time. So take the time to remind yourself of that. And then make sure you do recognize who is my author, what is his or her purpose. A lot of times it will state that in the descriptive opening, and it'll definitely state the author, and sometimes it'll hint or actually lay right out what the purpose is. So make sure you know that. And even as something as simple as, is it a man or a woman? And is it a person who is distinguished or has a position of power? And, really think about who that author is in relation to the context, the situation, and that might help you understand where this author is coming from and understand what he or she is trying to say. That's key for these types of texts. Make sure you use that standard from freshman year of decoding language. You do have to really not freak out. Don't get frustrated or overwhelmed. Be ready to find words that you do not recognize, that you do not understand. It's going to happen. And don't be complacent. Don't just skim right over them and assume that it's no big deal. Just use the context. Use what you know to figure out what you don't. So look at the context clues, the sentence before and after, even the sentence itself. Sometimes an author will actually repeat the idea twice. And so in a follow-up sentence, they're giving you synonyms for a word that you may not have known in the previous one. So note that and look for that. Also, you guys know some roots, some prefixes, some suffixes. Use that knowledge to decode the words if you can. Or if the word sounds similar, the word that you don't know sounds similar to something that you do know, see if that might make sense in the context of the situation. So take the time to figure out those words, in the context of what you're reading. And something that's really, really helpful, has been insanely helpful to me over the years, is taking the time to paraphrase, put it in my own words, any part that is confusing, anything that's tricky, any section, any sentence, any group of sentences. I make sure I stop when I'm confused. If I'm confused, stop for a second. Back to the earlier slide of rereading, I would reread, and I would take the time to just pop it into my own words as quickly as I can. And I would even, maybe if I couldn't figure out that specific part, I might reread the entire paragraph and try to see if I could get the gist of the paragraph. What is the point of this section, based on what I do recognize, what I do know, and then jot that down. So work with what you know to really help you gain confidence in the rest of it. And always be on the lookout for figurative language. A lot of these texts will employ extended metaphors, similes, personification, hyperboles. They're going to employ some figurative language, not always, but often. And make sure, if you feel like something doesn't make sense, ask yourself, is this supposed to be figurative? Is this some sort of metaphor for something? And sometimes it is. And don't kind of take yourself there when it's not the truth, right? Make sure you have your ideas are well-founded, that yes, this is a metaphor for something, but just be ready to unpack that figurative language if it does exist. And then obviously this last one, read more. I have told students I've told students this many, many times. The best way to do any academic skill better is to read more. It's research-based. This one's really obvious. If you want more texts, I have links here, and I'll share this slideshow with you so you can click these links. The first one is actually a link to the text. You can click by author and click on the text. The second one is more of a list of authors, and you'd have to kind of click a little bit more to get to the text, or you could just search one of those authors' names on Google and see if you can find something. But the more you read, the better you are at understanding what you are reading, regardless of the century that it comes from. So let's take a sec. I'm just going to make sure, I'm going to check time here. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes before screencast will cut me off. So let's see if in 6 minutes I can, practice these strategies with you a little bit. This was the rhetorical analysis prompt on the 2006 exam a long time ago, but very first and foremost, right, if we're going to read up here and read the description, the passage below is an excerpt from On the Want of Money, an essay written by 19th century author William Hazlitt. Read the passage carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze the rhetorical strategies Hazlitt uses to develop his position about money. So right away, we know we have this man. We know he's a 19th century author. Down here we see the date, 1827, so we're somewhere in the earlier part of the 1800s. We can access any of our knowledge we might know about that time. What is going on in the world. It doesn't say whether he's American or not, so we can't assume that he is. We're not really sure. There was a little bit more of a stock market crisis in Europe at this time. Maybe he's from there, but he is talking about money, right? He's talking about on the want of money. And right away, you have to recognize that on the want of money, want doesn't mean like, that I want money. It's I don't have it, right? I don't have the money. So I know they're very similar, but hopefully you're recognizing that you have enough from the context to say, all right, in the 1800s, they're talking about money. It's a man, and maybe stock markets aren't great at this time. Let's see what he has to say about the money. So as you start to read through, you can certainly pause this and see if you can read this a little bit more thoroughly, because I'm a little short on time and trying to squeeze this into 15 minutes. So certainly pause this if you need to. But even if we just look, just glance at this passage, you're going to notice there are no periods. Right? You talk about unpack, well, there's this one right here in the first sentence. Once the first sentence is done, the rest of it, they're all independent clauses joined by semicolons. So I might really want to make sure I understand this first sentence clearly before I go and try to unpack the rest. So it says, literally and truly, one cannot get on well in the world without money. Yes, that's actually something I understand. There's nothing in that sentence that I don't understand. So I can almost, if I were writing this, I would write in the margin, we need money in life, like money helps us live. I would write something over here, and then I would start to go through the rest of these sentences and see if I'm understanding what he's building up. To be in want of it is to pass through life with little credit or pleasure. It is to live out of the world, or to be despised if you come into it, right? And I'm going to, knowing myself as a reader and knowing great active reading strategies, I'm going to pause after a few lines just to make sure, just to give myself a minute to make sure I understand what I've read. And if not, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread it. So to be in want of it, to want it, is to pass through life with little credit or pleasure. Like I'm not getting any credit from anyone, like nobody really values me, I'm not getting any pleasure out of anything. It is to live out of the world. So I feel like I'm outside of the world. I'm kind of a loner. I'm not enjoying everything the world has to offer. And then it says, or to be despised if you come into it. So to be despised if you come into it, well, he seems to be using this pronoun it to refer to money throughout the whole entire thing. And I'm recognizing that and I'm saying, oh, well, or if you actually get some, if you have money, people are going to despise you. And then I'll keep going and say, it is not to be sent for to court or asked out to dinner or noticed on the street. Now, again, I'm going to pause because I know court as, the place where there's a judge and a jury. However, I have to question that meaning of it because in context, it says, or to ask out to dinner or noticed in the street. And these are things you might do of someone you're interested in. And then I can remember, oh yeah, there is this terminology to court someone in the old days is to, go after them and see if they'll be in a relationship with you. So I would here say, well, that's talking about you can't just go after money and get it that easily. You can't just say, I desire you, please come now. And I'm figuring that out as I go. So I've tried to, I'm going to check time again because I'm nervous that, we're at about a minute left. But what I'm trying to show you here is that there's a very methodical way to practice going through these texts. Obviously, in an exam situation, you can't talk through this as slowly as I'm talking you through it right now. However, when you practice this over and over again, a lot of what I'm saying out loud is internal dialogue in your head, and you can work through the passage pretty quickly. And so the last thing, actually, if I make this big again, I'll just show you you know, if you continue to read, you're going to end up running into, say over here, to grow crabbed or morose or querulous, dissatisfied with everyone. Again, you might not know crabbed as a word like this, but you're like, oh, if someone's crabby, they're angry, morose, sad. You might not know that, but then it says dissatisfied. There's enough context here that it's okay if you don't know morose. It's okay if you don't know querulous. You don't have to assume that you're not going to understand the passage. So just realize that authors will often give you lots of synonyms within their sentences to help you, realize that you do know what